Hello. In case you weren't aware, this is actually episode 3 of a 4-episode series regarding why I dislike being a Star Wars fan. If you haven't seen the last 2 episodes, episode 1 especially, then I would recommend that you do so. Main reasons that I go over some of the rules of what I talk about, but also it might help inform you of my opinions going forward. But if you have seen those previous episodes, or just don't really give a shit, then let's move right on, shall we? Before we get to the next film, I'm going to address the one decision that people to this day are still talking about when it comes to Star Wars. In May of 2011, George Lucas met with then CEO of Walt Disney Studios, Bob Iger. They discussed the possibility of George Lucas selling Lucasfilm as he was planning on retiring from making films and/or producing them. In January of 2012, George Lucas had announced said retirement from producing big-budget films and instead focused on much smaller independent films. In June of the same year, Kathleen Kennedy, a frequent collaborator with Steven Spielberg, was appointed as co-chairman of Lucasfilm. She would work alongside George Lucas until his actual final day as CEO. Remember this as it will be important later. On October 30th, 2012, Disney had announced its plan to acquire Lucasfilm and all of its subsidiaries for $4.05 billion, about half of it in cash and the other half in Disney stocks. To this day, George Lucas is still the largest individual shareholder when it comes to Disney. Disney's acquisition of Lucasfilm was completed on December 21st, 2012. Here's where things get interesting, though. Kathleen Kennedy became president of Lucasfilm, while George was kept on as a creative consultant initially. This is where it actually wraps back around to Star Wars itself. Now, George had possible ideas for episodes 7, 8, and 9. However, he had no intention of actually making them himself. A direct quote from Lucas states, "I always said I wasn't going to do anymore, and that's true, because I'm not going to do anymore. But that doesn't mean I'm unwilling to turn it over to Kathy to do more." George actually attended early story meetings, mostly just telling them, don't do this, but this is okay, that kind of thing. He also handed in story treatments for episodes 7 through 9, requested it only be read by Kathleen Kennedy and certain execs from Disney. As I'm sure a lot of you know, those treatments weren't used. Disney instead opted for their own story. After that, George Lucas didn't have much further involvement as it was clear they didn't particularly want him around. George later expressed his feelings about selling Lucasfilm as he wanted to be there to guide them, but at the same time, he wanted to just leave it alone for other people to work on as he didn't have much further interest in making those movies, or at least not directly. This is a very complicated topic to talk about for some people. I'm going to save it for later, but believe me, this is probably going to be the biggest underlying thing from here on out. Let's move on to the actual development of this film. There were plenty of names thrown around on who was going to direct this film. Names that were considered included Brad Bird, David Fincher, Jon Favreau, Guillermo del Toro, Matthew Vaughn, Colin Trevorrow, Ben Affleck, and apparently Neil Blomkamp. A lot of those names either had other projects so they couldn't do it, or just simply had no interest. Although the film would find its director when Steven Spielberg suggested someone to Kathleen Kennedy. That person was Jeffrey Jacob Abrams. Usually just goes by J.J. Abrams. Interestingly, he initially declined the offer, his reasoning being that up until that point, and funnily enough still to this day, he'd only directed one original film. He'd done Mission Impossible 3, he'd done Star Trek and Star Trek Into Darkness, which he just tried to replicate Star Wars with anyway, but I digress. However, Kathleen Kennedy was the one to convince him to do the film, especially since JJ was a big fan of Star Wars. With a script co-written by Lawrence Kasdan, Michael Arndt, and JJ himself, filming would begin in February of 2014. The production went mostly smoothly, except for when production had to be halted for 2 weeks due to Harrison Ford fracturing his ankle, which was caused by a set malfunction. This actually gave Abrams the opportunity to retool the film as he thought some of it wasn't working, mainly Rey and Finn's dynamic. Okay. We can finally move on to the film itself. Okay, so let's just make sure that we got everything, and... God damn it! Yes, I'm just gonna get out of the way now. This is just episode 4 again. Here's the thing, however. I can kind of see why they did it. Do I think it was a good idea, especially in hindsight? Not particularly, but I understand why they did it. Keep in mind, this was at a time when the prequels were still widely hated, so they probably wanted to go back to basics with Star Wars, a film that was reminiscent of the original trilogy, which only makes sense as this is supposed to be a continuation of that. However, in doing so, they kind of shot themselves in the foot, because yes, it was like the original trilogy. However, it was arguably too much like the original. If you wanted to avoid the prequels, that's fine, you do you, but this is too damn similar. Of course, it's also ironic that J.J. Abrams initially declined because he was sick of making sequels, then just made Episode 4 again anyway. There's actually plenty of other things that this film decides to not explore, even though it fucking should. In fact, there's one major thing that surprisingly goes unanswered the entire trilogy. How the fuck did the First Order rise to power? No, seriously, how? Now here's the thing. I actually do know the answer to this. However, it's not actually in the movies. And that's the problem. I know that the reason the First Order was able to rise to power was because of just how shitty a job the New Republic was doing. Hell, it's even slightly explored in later projects. Ones that came out after the sequel trilogy, but I digress. The problem is that it's never explained in the films, or at least not enough to be satisfying. I shouldn't have to read a book or play a game or whatever just to figure out something. If it's something like a small plot hole, fine, whatever. But when it's a major aspect of your overarching story, that's a huge problem. You had 3 movies and you never thought about this once? We need more than just a single sentence in the opening crawl to know what's going on. Now I'm going to connect this back with Episode 4 because I need to explain why it worked there and not here. In Episode 4, the reason you don't exactly need to know how the Empire is in power is because it's not important for the story. You don't need context on who the Emperor is, you just need to know the Empire is bad, and you get plenty of that throughout the original trilogy. You don't need to watch the prequels in order to understand Episode 4, especially since they didn't exist yet. However, the reason why I don't think it's okay just randomly establishing this is because it's a sequel. We saw the Empire fall in Return of the Jedi. I don't care if 30 years have passed, we need an explanation on why suddenly the New Republic is almost gone. Another problem I have with this film is its humor. Now, I'm typically not one to describe certain kinds of humor as Marvel humor or MCU humor, especially since I feel like that term has been misused to the point that no one knows what it means anymore. But even back in 2015, I remember thinking the humor was odd. It has those quips and random out-of-place humor that doesn't really fit the tone of the scene. This is what I find a lot of MCU humor to be, and it's certainly noticeable throughout this trilogy. Now, it's not to say the previous trilogies weren't funny. Oh god no, the prequels alone had some great moments. However, it's used at the most inappropriate times here. Even back in 2015, I knew something was off the moment I heard Poe say,
"So who talks first? You talk first? I talk first?"
Like, this isn't funny. It's out of place. It's also just the amount of times they do it in this film is annoying. Like, starting in the 3rd act, there should have been little to no jokes. But unfortunately, we couldn't have that. This might be more of just a personal thing, but I just really don't like how they handled a lot of the humor in this film. Honestly, I think the only one that worked for me was Kylo Ren throwing a temper tantrum. Otherwise, I don't like it. Now, I've mentioned before how I actually like the MCU, but I'm sometimes not the biggest fan of its humor. So to have it in Star Wars as well, I'm not a fan. If I wanted to watch a Marvel movie, I'd watch a goddamn Marvel movie. Keep that shit out of my Star Wars. I also think how Poe was handled is a little clunky. I say that because, according to JJ, he originally wanted Poe to live, but in earlier drafts of the script, he just wound up killing him off. It was actually Oscar Isaac that wanted the character to not die in the film. JJ wound up taking that earlier idea and worked it into the screenplay they already had, and you can tell that something's off. Now, I really like Finn and Poe's dynamic, something I'll cover in great detail later, but I think the way Poe is awkwardly handled in the rest of the film after his death is weird. You can tell most, if not all of it, was reshoots because outside of the opening and one scene, it's just him in his cockpit when it comes to blowing up Starkiller Base. I admit it's just a small thing, for now, but it is a little distracting when you notice it, and realize why it is that way. There's one more criticism I'd like to mention, and that's the ending. Now, I'm not referring to Rey handing Luke his lightsaber. That imagery is still striking, and it still gets me every time I see it. I will die on this hill, I do not care. No, what I'm referring to is how Rey was able to get there. I'm referring to R2-D2 randomly waking up from what may as well be a coma just to complete the star map. Now, I actually think it makes sense that R2 would essentially put himself on low power mode when Luke disappears. I feel like he would have a close enough connection to Luke to do that. But why does he wake up when he does? It just comes out of nowhere. He has no idea that Starkiller Base is blown up. He gets up just because. And if you want to say, oh, it's because he sensed that BB-8 had the missing piece of the star map, that can't work either because of the fact that when BB-8 first found R2, he still had that bit of the map. There's no justifiable reason for R2 waking up at that specific moment. The funny thing, on the commentary track, JJ feels the need to mention how R2 has the bit of the map he does, but doesn't clarify why he wakes up when he does. I'm now going to go into some compliments I have for the film. I actually really like Rey and Finn's dynamic in this film. I'll obviously have some things to say for the later films, but one movie at a time. I genuinely love their dynamic and sort of how they grew their connection. I'm glad JJ did those rewrites because from what I can put together of their original dynamic, it wouldn't have worked nearly as well. I also actually like Kylo Ren. Kind of. In this film, he's completely fine. I like how the idea with Kylo is how he's being tortured with the light side of the Force, while Vader was tortured with the dark side of the Force, kind of making the antagonist the opposite of Vader, where his compassion is the thing that's hurting him, rather than his anger. Hell, even the reason Kylo Ren and Vader wear their masks are different. Vader wore his to keep him alive when he wasn't in a meditation pod or bacta tank, and could also cover up his scarred appearance. However, Kylo Ren wears it just because. Probably some yada yada, it's not a phase, Mom, bullshit. Granted, execution is a different story, but I actually like how it's handled here. He sees Darth Vader as a role model, and when he's told he'll never be as strong as him, it's probably the most hurtful thing he's ever heard. He's basically a moody teenager if he had a lightsaber. I also think him killing off Han Solo made sense. Now, was it a bit much to have Han Solo die in the first film in this trilogy? Maybe. But I'd also argue that it was an attempt to essentially let the audience know that shit is gonna get serious. Now, would I prefer that most of that was saved for a second movie? Probably. However, I get why they did this, especially since both Harrison Ford and Richard Marquand wanted Han Solo to die in Return of the Jedi. Damn, Harrison Ford hated Star Wars even back then. There's one more thing that I'd like to mention, and it's regarding Luke's absence in this film. I like it. I still remember December 19th of 2015 when the words Star Wars came on screen. It was met with cheers. Then the very first line of the text crawl. Luke Skywalker has disappeared. It shook me to my core.
What do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean?
Would I have preferred that he was there? Yes. I mean, he was the main character in the original trilogy, so it would be nice to follow it up. But I think why it was done here was actually really smart. JJ explained on the commentary track that the reason that decision was made was because he felt that if Luke was there, he would undermine the new characters. Essentially, the thought process was the audience might think, why would I give a shit about these new guys when the character I'm already attached to is right here? I'd argue that's true, and still is to this day. There was also the idea that since 30 years would have passed in universe, some people wouldn't even think Luke, the Jedi, or even the Force were real. They might think they're myths. In fact, that very idea is what convinced JJ to work on the film, as that was the idea Kathleen Kennedy presented to him. Now, this is something I'd been dying to talk about. See, the interesting thing about John Williams' journey making music for these films is the order they were made. Because the original trilogy was, well, original, he just wrote an original score. However, because the next set of films was a trilogy of prequels, he had to write music that was either completely disconnected from the original trilogy, or had to write themes that sound like they would naturally evolve into later themes. Take Anakin's theme to Imperial March, for example. But here, it was like letting a kid loose in a candy store. He'd finally be able to build upon those themes from the original trilogy and make all new music where he wouldn't have to worry about making them sound like they'd build into already existing themes. I swear this makes sense in my head. I feel like this philosophy is evident by just 3 main themes in this soundtrack. The first one being Rey's theme. People have found many different ways to use Rey's theme and how it connects to Imperial March, Binary Sunset, hell, even Yoda's theme. Were all of them intentional? Probably not, unless John Williams is playing like 40 chess with his music. However, I just love how it sounds. The second theme I'd like to highlight is Kylo Ren's theme. Although I feel like it's another Imperial March and Empire Strikes Back feeling, where it might represent the First Order in general and not just Kylo Ren. This theme is great because John Williams showcases how to make you scared with just 5 notes. Okay, technically 9 is the full motif, which is the same as Imperial March, but those first 5 are what people focus on the most. The third theme I want to highlight is March of the Resistance. Okay, right off the bat, the fact it's called March of the Resistance is interesting considering how another major track with March in the title is associated with Darth Vader. I think that's the perfect mindset with this piece. It's not nearly as heroic if I have to describe it as anything. It feels a lot more sinister than it's letting on. I have no idea if that makes any sense, but it makes sense to me. There's also one last fun fact I'd like to bring up before we move on. Apparently, there's a track that John Williams didn't compose for this film. It's the song that plays when we're in Maz Kanata's castle. John Williams apparently asked JJ if he could get anyone else to compose music for that scene, as he wanted to focus on the other music. So JJ decided to work with Lin-Manuel Miranda to make a theme for Maz Kanata's castle. I'm just as confused as you are, believe me. I unfortunately couldn't find much on sound design, so we're skipping straight to production design. Even though this film still uses a shit ton of CGI, I'm actually surprised at just how often they still used practical effects in some manner. I guess it makes sense if the goal was to evoke the feeling of the original trilogy more and how it was all practical. I said all practical. For example, the only part that's CGI on Unkar Plutt is his face, and that was only because the actual costume was so hot inside, Simon Pegg couldn't properly emote with the head on. There are still shots of BB-8 where he's entirely CG, but they always tried to make him practical if they could. Granted, they digitally painted out the puppeteers, but they also did that for C-3PO and Phantom Menace, and that's a common practice nowadays anyway. Another example is when the holochess table is shown again in this film. It wasn't just reused footage or CGI to look like stop motion. They actually got Phil Tippett, who did the effect in the original, to redo it just for this shot. Maz Kanata's castle is also quite impressive from a practical standpoint. According to Abrams, the only thing that's entirely CGI is Maz herself. Everything else was on set, and he never states this, but may have had only a few CGI touch-ups later. Probably one of my favorite effects in the entire film is something so simple, and yet I love it. It's when Rey's cooking food, and there's the bread that magically cooks itself. I actually thought it was CGI for the longest time, but no, it's all practical. It was a bladder pushing up the bread, and there was a tube hidden in the bottom to suck out all the liquid. The only CG that was used was to digitally paint out the tube that sucked out the water. Now, most of the things I saw never went too in-depth on this, but I actually don't mind the CGI work. Like, there's only 2 entirely CGI characters, those being Maz Kanata and Snoke. Actually, fun fact, Matt Reeves is a good friend of J.J. Abrams, probably due to them working together on Cloverfield. Great movie, by the way, I highly recommend it. Anyways, because of this, JJ got to see an early cut of Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, which didn't even have most of the CGI done yet. Andy Serkis's performance really stuck out to JJ, and he wanted to hire him for this film. Other than that, I feel like there's not much more to talk about, as there isn't as much in-detail behind-the-scenes info on the CGI here as there was on the prequels. Captain Phasma's design was an early design for Kylo Ren. It was ultimately rejected because in-universe it made no sense for him to be wearing Stormtrooper armor. The original script actually not only explained how Maz Kanata got Anakin's original lightsaber, but apparently it was going to be the opening of the movie. As much as I don't like how it's never explained, I think the opening of the film we got was so much better. Apparently, JJ had a whole backstory for the Knights of Ren. We'll get to them later. The stormtrooper played by Daniel Craig was affectionately nicknamed FN-007. The reason why he was even in the movie was because he was filming Spectre on the same lot that this movie was filming, so they asked if he wanted to be in the film. Daniel Craig's apparently a huge Star Wars fan, so he agreed to do it. While I admit this film has many flaws, including its mostly unoriginal plot, I admit I'm always going to have a soft spot for this film. It's the first Star Wars film I saw in theaters. I have fond memories of this film and theorizing where everything was going to go. What's Snoke's deal? Who are Rey's parents? Why did Luke go into exile? A million questions for my young mind to try to find answers to. I'll give The Force Awakens a 7.5 out of 10. You could do better, but at the same time, you could do far, far worse. Rogue One is a fascinating movie. Mainly because, I'll be honest, I don't understand why this is the one Star Wars movie post-Disney buyout that people still go crazy over. Like, there's great ideas here, and it is an interesting take on Star Wars, but I don't see why this is the one that slipped through the cracks. In 2003, visual effects supervisor John Knoll pitched an idea about the rebels that stole the Death Star plans before the beginning of Episode 4. It obviously went nowhere. However, John Knoll pitched the idea again after Disney acquired Lucasfilm. He didn't want the idea to go to waste. Luckily, there were plans to release one-off movies in the Star Wars universe, and the idea was picked up. Sometime later, after people at Lucasfilm saw Monsters from 2010, they thought Gareth Edwards, that film's director, was a good choice for this new movie. They were also in luck because Gareth Edwards is a massive Star Wars fan, and even spent his 30th birthday in Tunisia visiting the locations where they shot Episode 4. Here's the thing about Gareth Edwards, though. Gareth Edwards also directed films such as Godzilla 2014, The Creator from 2 years ago, and Jurassic World Rebirth. I'll admit the only film of his that I haven't seen is Jurassic World Rebirth, as I've only seen the first 2 Jurassic Park films and I don't particularly care. However, I have seen all of his other films, including Monsters. I personally think Gareth Edwards has a problem with directing his actors. I don't know, there's just something about his directing where it feels like the characters in his films can't emote the way you'd expect them to. I find this is most notable in Godzilla 2014 and The Creator. However, there is one strength I'll give this guy. This goes for all of his films that I've seen. Gareth Edwards is great at directing visuals, and more specifically, scale. In Godzilla 2014, you can really feel just how tall Godzilla actually is. Something that I feel like was lost in the later MonsterVerse movies, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The Creator also had beautiful cinematography. It's no different here. This is probably the first Star Wars film that I'd 100% say has very stunning cinematography, and it's such a shame it wasn't nominated for Best Cinematography at the Oscars. Scenes like when the Death Star destroys Jeddah City is just beautiful. Not only does it start off with a recreation of the Alderaan scene from the original, but it shows what the Death Star's destructive capabilities are on ground level, and quite frankly, it looks terrifying. It wasn't even at full power. Scenes like that are where I believe Gareth Edwards' strengths lie as a director, because otherwise, there's many problems I have when it comes to his direction on other parts of the film. Right off the bat, I want to compliment it for kind of subverting expectations on what the film's going to be like. Because when you go to a Star Wars movie, what do you expect? A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, then all of a sudden... But this film goes about it differently. You still get the "a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away" text, but rather than going into the Star Wars theme, it just jumps right into the film. It still has a similar jump in terms of the music, but it's not the main Star Wars theme. I think it's great at immediately telling you, this isn't like other Star Wars movies. Even better considering how much of the criticism levied against The Force Awakens was how similar it was to Episode 4. I'm assuming it wasn't intentional, but it's still great timing nonetheless. Something I also didn't even notice until it was pointed out to me was that this film doesn't use wipes for scene transitions. That's like a staple of Star Wars. Hell, people call it a Lucas wipe for a reason. Even though it was used earlier in film serials and Akira Kurosawa films, but I digress. But I think that was another smart choice. Something I'll also praise this film for is that it was trying to be more like a traditional war film. Now, I've made it clear before that I'm not the biggest fan of those types of films, but for some reason, I don't mind as much if they're much more fantastical in nature, an example being War for the Planet of the Apes. I like how this film is not only a lot darker, but I feel like it also further expands on a theme that was set up in Empire Strikes Back. Mainly that there isn't a good or bad per se, just a whole lot of gray. Granted, in Empire, and especially Return of the Jedi, it was focusing on the Empire and the good in it. Here, it's the opposite, mainly in how the rebellion isn't all sunshine and rainbows. Hell, even having Saw Gerrera in here to have a sort of extremist side of the rebellion was interesting. Granted, he died before we could really get any development with him, but whatever. I think adding these layers of complexity was a good thing. Not to say there wasn't an issue with these are the good guys and these are the bad guys in Episode 4, but I think the reason why people generally prefer Empire Strikes Back, and weirdos like myself who prefer Return of the Jedi, is because of the shades of gray in this conflict. If the idea was to make this more like a traditional war film, it makes sense to focus on the fact that in wars, everybody loses. They all think what they're doing is for the greater good, but that isn't always the case. It makes sense to showcase the darker aspects of the rebellion, especially since the original trilogy already focused on the good aspects of the Empire, more specifically Darth Vader. However, there's one big criticism I have of this film, and I think most people agree with me on it. Who gives a fuck about the characters? Seriously, there are only 2 characters I fully enjoyed. One of them was because I got to know more of him through a spin-off show, and the other one was just a snarky prick who happened to be a droid. But seriously, who cares about these characters? The best test I can do is ask you what their names even are. Like, who's this? His name is Baze Malbus. I just watched the movie and I still had to look up who that was. Who's this guy? That's Chirrut Imwe. Had to search that one up too. The only character names I even remember are Jyn Erso, probably because she's the protagonist, Cassian Andor, because of a later project, K2SO, because he's my favorite character from the film, and Bodhi Rook. And that's because this was always the character people used as their example of, what's this character's name? The problem with large ensemble casts like this is you don't have much time to learn about them, let alone connect with them. That especially won't help you when literally all of them are going to be dead by the end of the film. If you want big casts like this to work, usually you want sequels or whatever so audiences can connect with them more. The original Star Wars trilogy knew this. You learned more about the characters the further the series went along. I will say this. I commend them for what they were trying to accomplish with this cast, especially with how it relates to the overall theme of the film. But if you don't give the proper time to establish and make us care about them, then we aren't going to care much when they die. This isn't the first movie I've covered in this series that didn't have John Williams as its composer. However, it is the first notable one. This film's music was done by Michael Giacchino, who has done so many movies that I wouldn't be able to even name them all. However, notable ones include 7 MCU projects, one of which he even directed, 7 Pixar films, including both Incredibles films, the Kelvin Timeline Star Trek trilogy, the Jurassic World trilogy, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, War for the Planet of the Apes, and The Batman, just to name a few. He's a very prolific composer, and I quite like his work. It's no different here. I don't know if I'll be able to go as in-depth with it as I did with the other films, but I will highlight the theme he gives to the Empire. Now, because Imperial March is already reserved for Vader, and is even used in this film, Michael decided to have a different theme to represent the Empire in this film. It has a similar foreboding tone that Imperial March does, but it's uniquely its own. I also love just the main theme. There's still elements of the original Rebel theme by John Williams, but again, it's its own thing. I think this is the first film since Return of the Jedi to have that lived-in look that George Lucas wanted in the original trilogy. Basically, everything is grimy and not very well cleaned. Now, I wouldn't say it's to the level of Episode 4, but given how this takes place right before it, it makes sense that the world looks like this, especially if the intent was that you could watch the films back-to-back and not see much difference. I also appreciate just how much practical effects were used where they could. I also think they had a really great mentality to it. The idea was that they wouldn't be emphasized. There wouldn't really be any moments where you'd just go, "Whoa, look at how cool that effect was!" It presents them as very matter-of-fact, because, well, to the characters, this isn't unusual. There were about 30 unique characters, all of which were usually just people in suits. On top of that, the head was usually puppeted by remote control, an example being Admiral Raddus. However, there was one that was pointed out by one of the featurettes on this film, which there were strangely a lot of. Biston, referred to as Space Monkey by the crew. They did something different with him where the actor used their real eyes, very similar to how Peter Mayhew's eyes are what you see on Chewbacca. Okay, this is going to be a complicated one. Not because it's hard to explain how the effects were done, but because of this. So in case you somehow don't know, Peter Cushing has been dead for 30 years, 22 when this film initially came out. Now, I know they got permission from Peter Cushing's estate, but, stuff like this is exactly what SAG-AFTRA was fighting against back in 2023. Like, I get why it was done. This film ties in directly with Episode 4, and it makes sense why he'd be here. But at the same time, this could be seen as incredibly disrespectful. Not to mention, the effect itself just doesn't look that good. He looks like a PS5 character, but none of the environment fits that. The way this effect was done was motion capture by Guy Henry. The philosophy that Guy had was that he wasn't only imitating Cushing with either voice or face. He was trying to embody the spirit of the character. I will say this. Even if he doesn't really sound like Peter Cushing, he does have certain mannerisms in the way that Tarkin spoke. As I'm sure you can tell, I'm not the biggest fan of the effect. Even if it was apparently okay with everyone involved, the effect still looks wonky. It's like the Ian Holm effect in Alien Romulus. Honestly, CGI Tarkin should have been relegated to just one scene, not only to focus more on other effects and or make that one better, but also so it doesn't just feel like it's being rubbed in. I should also mention the de-aged Leia at the end. It's also not that good, but for a completely different reason. With Tarkin, it was a full digital recreation of Peter Cushing's head. With Leia, it's more like a really bad deepfake. Hell, Ant-Man only did this kind of effect a year earlier, and it looked a lot better. Still not great, but better. It was a single 10-second shot. How does it look this strange? Okay, now to focus on the other effects. I actually thought they were quite good. Aside from the previous two mentioned, there was really only one shot where I thought it looked subpar. However, it was only like 2 seconds. Otherwise, things like K2SO look great. There were a few moments where I could tell K2 wasn't there, but there were others where I was convinced he was a puppet or something. I also think it's interesting how Alan Tudyk portrayed him. When you see other Imperial droids, they walk very robotically, almost perfectly, if you will. But K2 doesn't. He slouches a little, he moves his arms, his walk has a little bit more unevenness. For lack of a better phrase, he's more human. I think it's impressive how Alan played him, and Alan Tudyk is also just hilarious, so he's great at portraying that part of K2 as well. When Riz Ahmed got the part of Bodhi, he sent tape after tape after tape to Gareth Edwards about the different ways he could play Bodhi. Seeing some of them are quite interesting and kind of a look into another timeline where that could have been Bodhi. There's actually a cameo by Chopper from Star Wars Rebels in this film. You may have already known that, but still. There's also a reference to Hera from the same show. Someone requests to see her over the intercom in Yavin 4. In the shot recreating the destruction of Alderaan, one of the operators is played by Rian Johnson, director of The Last Jedi. One of the rebel soldiers at the end is played by Gareth Edwards himself. I see what this film was going for, but ultimately, I think there's too much holding it back for me to truly love it like I do some of the other films we covered. Great concept, great visual direction, but characters that aren't very memorable, a resurrected actor that doesn't look very good, and a film that's basically overshadowed by one of its last scenes, which should have been the first and only time we see Vader in the film, but I digress, make it a very uneven and overall not that entertaining experience. I'll give Rogue One a 7 out of 10. I wish I could see the appeal, but I just can't. This is gonna be a hard one to talk about. Mainly because whenever this movie is mentioned, you find one of two reactions. Overwhelming love, or overwhelming hate, with little to no in between. I can see both sides' arguments, but I think it's just a little bit overblown. From both sides. In January of 2014, Rian Johnson was in talks to write and direct this installment of the sequel trilogy. Later in August, he confirmed himself that that was the case. He worked closely with J.J. Abrams to not only ensure that there wasn't any continuity problems, but also to make it flow smoothly from one film to the next. Whether that worked well or not, I feel like is a different story, but at least they tried to put in that effort. Even though principal photography didn't start until February of 2016, they still shot for 4 days at Skellig Michael with a second unit in September of 2015, mostly for establishing shots and other things they may have needed. This was due to weather conditions and how basically any other time of the year wouldn't have worked. These were shot for all the scenes of Rey and Luke on Ahch-To. Principal photography ended in July of 2016, although there were still reshoots and the like afterwards. Rian Johnson was certainly an interesting choice for this film. The reason being, not only the kind of films he makes, but also the fact that at the time, he wasn't really well known. The only super notable film he did before this one was Looper. Safe to say, it was a strange choice for a Star Wars film. Then again, people like Irvin Kershner and Richard Marquand may have been strange choices for the original trilogy as well, so it's not too unheard of. Now, I should say that I haven't watched many of Rian Johnson's other films, but I don't feel comfortable calling him a bad filmmaker, not by a long shot. He makes super interesting films, and I think, out of the ones I've seen anyway, he seems to have a style, mainly in the way that he subverts certain genres, which is definitely apparent here. In case you haven't seen the Knives Out films, you really should. They're great. Now, do I think some of the stuff that Rian Johnson subverts in this film was a good choice? Not entirely, but there are some truly interesting ideas here. Even then, he still heavily plays into how a Star Wars film typically goes. I know a main complaint about the film is just how much shit is going on. But that's a very Star Wars thing. George Lucas himself has even stated that starting with American Graffiti, he loved taking stories that were disconnected from each other and reconnecting them at the end. Think about it, the only Star Wars films that never really did that were A New Hope, Phantom Menace, and even then it's only for like the first half or so, and The Force Awakens. Every other Star Wars film has at least two stories that would be intercut with each other. Empire Strikes Back had Luke on Dagobah and the rest of the gang on Bespin. Return of the Jedi had Luke confronting Vader and Palpatine, Han, Leia, Chewie, C-3PO, and R2 on Andor, and Lando fighting a space battle waiting for the shield generator on Endor to be shut down. Attack of the Clones had Obi-Wan figuring out the deal with the clones and Anakin falling in love with Padme. Revenge of the Sith has Obi-Wan dealing with General Grievous and Anakin being manipulated by Palpatine to turn to the dark side, and Yoda on Kashyyyk for a small portion. This film is probably the most insane with it though, especially since it's like this from the very beginning, unlike every other film that only has the story split after the 30-minute mark or so. This is also the film with the most going on. There's Rey and Luke on Ahch-To, which then evolves to Rey and Kylo. There's Finn and Rose, we'll get to them. And finally, there's Poe and Admiral Holdo. Ultimately, I think one of the major issues here is that Rian was forced to make the middle part of a trilogy. No matter what, you're fully locked in on what you're really allowed to do, because you have to deal with established characters that you may not want to utilize if you don't care for them, but you also can't do too much because it ultimately needs to lead to a finale. If you do something too drastic, then you fuck over whoever's directing the next film if it's not being done by you. I'll go through the different storylines as I think you'll start finding the major strengths and issues of this film in them. I'm going to start with the Finn and Rose stuff because, I'll be honest, yeah, it's the worst part of this film. Not because I don't like Rose exactly, but it's the fact that it just makes Finn go through his character arc in Force Awakens again. Seriously, the only difference is that in this one, he's already basically part of the Resistance. But it's still the same arc of having the courage to fight for what you believe in. Just in this one, it's a lot less subtle. Somehow. And again, just a waste. Nothing made me more upset than realizing that apparently earlier versions of the script had Finn and Poe, not Finn and Rose. I'm not even kidding that it would have been like 1,000 times better. The stuff with Poe could easily be substituted for what Finn's role in this film was. Do you really think Finn needs to know what war is like? Or the mistreatment of children? He is literally the last person who would need to be reminded of that. But you know who might? Poe. The opening of the film showcases how cocky Poe is, and how he might not be taking this as seriously as he should be. Shouldn't he be the one who needs to be reminded of this? No, instead let's give him a subplot that literally wouldn't have happened if he just fucking knew what was going on so he wouldn't start a mutiny. Look, I get why people don't like Rose, but I think that's more of a writing issue, because Kelly Marie Tran actually does pretty well with what she's given. It's just what she's given is not exactly the best. I get what Rian Johnson was going for, especially since he literally spells it out in the commentary track, but it's such an odd way to do it, especially with Finn of all characters. Okay, so the idea with Finn in this film was that he was going to be having an internal conflict about this war. Rose was going to be the angel on his shoulder, and DJ was going to be the devil on his other shoulder. One telling him to fight for what he believes in, and the other telling him that he shouldn't care and that he'll be better off. Again, why with Finn? This is where it starts becoming clear that no one really knew what to do with Finn. Which is so strange because he was the co-protagonist of The Force Awakens. It seems so odd that they somehow didn't know what to do with him, especially since you could probably piece it together in the last film. This is made even worse when Finn faces Captain Phasma, and you start to realize that you don't care. The fight between him and Phasma is so underwhelming when it really shouldn't be. This should be a big moment for him, and theoretically be a major point in his overall arc about joining the Resistance. But nope, she just falls into an explosion and that's the end of it. Ultimately, I think that's why this is the worst part of this film. It's such a strange direction to take this character, and Rose and DJ don't have much to do outside of it. I already touched on this one, but seriously, this is the most useless part of this film. I get you want to make the point of Poe being cocky and brash, but this is the way to do it? No one tells Poe, or anyone, what the plan is, and still don't tell him when he finds out you're fueling the escape pods and calls you a traitor? Nice going, you caused him to start a mutiny instead. This is the most asinine part of the film, and the worst part is when all of this is explained to him, he's just cool with it? I'm sorry, but he tried to take over your fucking ship because you refused to tell him the plan. He should not be this receptive and just being like, oh yeah, that makes sense. This subplot is exactly why I don't understand Rian Johnson's earlier ideas of Finn and Poe being cut. The worst part is they were already separated for a while in Force Awakens, so why do that again? Wouldn't you want to keep them together more, especially since Poe was going to be killed off in the last film? It seems so strange to me to separate them, and this is what you put in its place. This is the best part of this film, and it's not even close. The main reason being not only does this part of the film have the most focus, but I think the ideas here are stellar. Luke having to live with what it means to be a legend and feeling it's unjustified is so damn intriguing. Honestly, Luke's character arc here is interesting as hell. I know everyone doesn't like how Luke was handled with him being all pessimistic and disheveled, but honestly, I think it was needed for this trilogy. Let me elaborate. If Luke was the same character that he was back in Return of the Jedi, That wouldn't feel like growth. What happened in those 30 years? Why wouldn't he have changed in those 30 years? However, here, it makes sense. It also gives reason to why Luke hasn't involved himself in this conflict. He feels like he ultimately started it. I know Mark Hamill famously didn't like this direction for Luke. That was until after he saw the film and has since regretted making that statement. But I'll give him props for still being professional about it and wanting to help Rian Johnson realize his vision. Hell, this is probably a hot take. This is Mark Hamill's best performance as Luke Skywalker. Even if you don't like what his character has become here, he still gives this performance the most he can. It really shows how much he grew as an actor in the 34 years between Return of the Jedi and this. Now, was this how I expected Luke to be in a sequel trilogy when I was little? No. But in hindsight, it kind of makes sense, especially regarding the last film. Luke thinking that the Jedi shouldn't exist anymore is bad on paper. However, when you actually look into why, I think it's really interesting. Mainly because he thinks the Jedi were doomed to fail and thinks the Force shouldn't be controlled by religion is really interesting. Now, this is probably a more Sith point of view, but I think that's also in his character. Remember, in Return of the Jedi, there were points where Luke was struggling with the dark side of the Force. Obviously, he overcame it in that moment, but that doesn't just go away. We've seen what happens when you ignore that conflict for long enough. I know people aren't happy with the way that he was handled here, and that he wasn't like what they'd thought he'd be. But that's also kind of the point. You're basically in Rey's shoes here. You'd heard all these stories of what he did for the galaxy and think he's what you need to solve this new conflict. But when you meet him, he's nothing like you'd heard. I also think Rey's story is interesting here too. Not only because the dynamic of her optimism with Luke's pessimism, but also how it explores her relationship with Kylo Ren and her as a character. Honestly, when it comes to this film specifically, I always question why people say she isn't a good character. Her arc is incredibly powerful here. Mainly because the idea that her parents were nobodies was exactly the last thing she wanted to hear, and also the last thing the audience probably wanted to hear. The prequels left us with the idea that Luke and Leia were separated for a reason because of who their father was. So when there's a similar situation with Rey, your mind starts racing. Who are they? Why did they leave her behind? But when you find out that they were nobodies, it breaks your heart. That's why it's so heartbreaking when you heard it the first time. When you saw the whole mirror scene with Rey, you were on the edge of your seat when Rey asked who her parents were, but you got nothing. I don't know how much further I can hammer this point home. I just think it's amazing how they handled that idea of who her parents were. Even how she started almost seeing Han as a father figure, thus why she was so angry at Kylo, then started projecting those onto Luke. It's literally spelt out, and I still don't understand why people don't mention it. Now, I know there's one big point of contention when it comes to this film. And I've even been guilty of mentioning it myself on this channel. Mainly in my 2024 video when I talk about character assassination. So yeah, that scene that essentially turned Ben Solo into Kylo Ren is misinterpreted. And that was including myself. I think most people act like Kylo Ren's perspective is the one that actually happened. The one where it looked like Luke was going to kill Ben for literally no reason. When in reality, it was because Luke sensed Snoke and had a primal instinct to get rid of the threat while he could. It was literally right after he ignited the lightsaber when he realized what he was doing. That was the moment he realized he fucked up. That the Luke Skywalker that everyone knew no longer existed. If he was still capable of making such rash decisions like that, then he shouldn't be a role model. Especially after Ben woke up and thought he was about to be killed. Again, I think this goes well with the idea that this legend of Luke Skywalker is just that. A legend. To expect our idols to be perfect 100% of the time is unreasonable. They can still make mistakes, in this case, a literal history-altering one. Although, there is one problem I have with this portion of the film. And it isn't all the stuff I just mentioned, it's Snoke. Mainly because, what's his personality? No, I'm being serious. What is he like as a person? You can't answer? That's my point. He has nothing to do before just being killed off by Kylo Ren besides being a poor Palpatine clone. Literally. Now, I get to a degree what Kylo Ren was doing, but at the same time, it comes at the expense of discarding what The Force Awakens was setting up. Not to mention, you got Andy Serkis for this, and you do nothing with him? This same year of 2017, War for the Planet of the Apes came out. That film is, in my opinion, Andy Serkis's best performance, and this is what you do with him? But that's really my only complaint about this section of the film. There's only one new theme I want to go over. Rose's theme. I really like it, and I think it does a great job at representing this part of the story. The best way that I can describe it is, it almost sounds whimsical. Like a hopeful whimsical, if that makes any sense at all. I think it's a really nice theme. Although, here's my issue with the rest of the music. What the hell is going on half of the time? Do you know how many times they play the Star Wars theme over the most random moments? They use it here the same way it was used in the prequels, where it's used more as an action theme rather than to represent someone. Now, if you remember way back when I talked about the original trilogy, the main theme represented Luke Skywalker. Makes sense if the main theme represents the main character. But here's the fucked up thing. It never plays for Luke once. It plays when BB-8 fires coins at a prison guard, but not for Luke? You want to know the best way to musically represent Luke? Play the main theme when he walks out of the Resistance base on Crate. That would feel so powerful and would make Luke's musical journey go full circle. Think about it. Throughout the film, that original theme never represented Luke. Luke was a different person from the legend. But the moment Luke decided to embrace that original legend again, it would play. It would be absolute cinema and would go perfectly with his death being paired with Binary Sunset. Speaking of Binary Sunset, why the fuck is it played so many times? No, seriously, why the fuck do they insist on it being played so often? Why is it trying to be the new main theme when, literally every film, except for Rogue One, so far starts like this? Like, it's actually infuriating. Also, one final note before we move on. This is the only Star Wars film with an official isolated score track. Why? Why, out of all 9 films, is it this one? Not to say this is a bad soundtrack, even though I have been complaining a lot, the soundtrack is still totally fine. But why this one specifically? How is that not an option for all of the other films? The music is one of the most important aspects of these films, and for it to really only be shown for this one is strange. Hell, another thing George Lucas always said about Star Wars was how they were glorified silent films. An idea where they could be watched without the dialogue and you'd still be able to understand what's going on. What better way of capturing that than having an isolated score track on all of the films? The original script called for 160 sets, although later on Rian Johnson was able to trim it down to around 125, which is still an insane amount of sets, even for a big blockbuster like this. This film has immaculate production design. You have to admit, even if you think the story is meh at best, this film looks stunning. It also has the most practical effects of any Star Wars film, or at least that's what the creature designer claims. You can tell. Like, honestly, I feel like it's really hard to tell which creatures are CG because of just the sheer amount of practical ones. Even Snoke and the Fathiers have practical elements. For example, there was a practical Snoke hand that was used in some scenes. And the scene where Finn and Rose first met a Fathier, it's entirely practical. I'd like to highlight one practical effect, and I think it's really interesting at how this was a major talking point. Yoda being a puppet again. I love this, obviously. I also love the reasoning. That being, if Yoda was portrayed by CGI, it wouldn't be how Luke remembered him. Which makes a whole lot of sense, because CGI Yoda is the prequel trilogy Yoda, not original trilogy Yoda. Ignore that Phantom Menace originally had a puppet version before the later re-releases. I also never realized that Frank Oz was actually the one who puppeted Yoda here too. I honestly think this was a great choice, and it's even highlighted by the documentary, The Director and the Jedi. I don't think that scene would have worked nearly as well because the performance Mark gives just wouldn't have happened if he was looking at a tennis ball covered in dots or whatever. Mark worked with the puppet back when they shot Empire Strikes Back, so it makes sense to make it nostalgic for Mark too, as it enhances his performance for Luke. I know Yoda doesn't look exactly like Empire, but that was to be expected. And luckily isn't that god-awful one from Phantom Menace. I think really the only thing I'll focus on here is Snoke. I think Snoke looks really good whenever he's on screen. You can tell this is probably where most of the special effects work was done, along with the father chase on Canto Bight. The only other CGI character I can really think of is Maz Kanata, for like 2 seconds. Everything else is relegated to the space stuff, or just whenever they'd need to extend a set digitally and stuff like that. Originally, there was going to be more Maz Kanata in the film, but Rian Johnson kept cutting her role down in rewrites, mainly because of how gargantuan the film already was, and probably would have been slightly cheaper on the CGI budget. The first shot in the casino on Canto Bight was inspired by the film Wings. Extra fun fact, that's the first film to ever win Best Picture at the Academy Awards. There was originally going to be more intercutting between the different storylines to keep the pace up, but Rian later realized just how frantic it all felt, so he calmed it down a little bit during the editing process. There's a cameo by Edgar Wright in this film. It's when they're on Crate. Ralph Ineson was going to be in this film. It wasn't going to be very long, only one scene, but he was there. However, his scene was cut for pacing reasons. Finally, the foreshadowing that Luke is only force projecting himself is actually really well done. I feel like there's the obvious of him not interacting with the salt on Crate, or the fact that he's using the lightsaber that was destroyed not even a few hours ago, but there's one main one that I wouldn't have even realized until it was pointed out to me. There's little to no noise that Luke makes that interact with the environment. You never even hear footsteps from him, which I think is extremely well done. I feel like the only people that would have noticed that, especially on a first watch, are people who work with sound on movies. But even then, it's so small you could even just chalk it up as a mistake. But no, it was intentional. This is such an interesting film to look at. However, there are many problems with it. Probably one of the worst things I realized was when I was watching the deleted scenes, there are really only 2 scenes where I understand why they were cut. But literally everything else, they should have kept in some way, shape, or form. The main one being Luke's reaction to Han's death. That really shouldn't have been cut. The audience isn't going to get bored over 2 extra shots that last just under a minute. Also, Phasma's original death is still anticlimactic, but I think it gives more insight to her character. It also kind of helps tie up a plot hole in Force Awakens. Finally, I think they should have kept the original opening. That being how Finn in his Bacta suit, or whatever that thing was the first thing you saw in the film. I feel like not only does it immediately tell you this isn't the movie you think it's going to be, but also it gives a nice character moment between Finn and Poe before they get separated again. Other than that, I genuinely don't understand the hatred of this film. Like, there are so many parts that are worth looking at, and I feel like they're always ignored. Not to mention, some of this hatred also caused Kelly Marie Tran to be continually harassed on social media. Not cool, guys. I should also state that I don't understand why people think this film is amazing either. There are still plenty of major flaws with this film. You don't need to defend every single decision just because you like it. No movie is perfect. The absolute last thing I'll mention is the fact that this was Carrie Fisher's last film before she sadly passed away. I think it's even sweet that when her name pops up in the credits, Leia's theme starts playing as well. Every time I see that scene of her freezing up in space, it's still surreal. Just the imagery of Carrie Fisher looking like she's dying still sits with me, even if it's in an uncomfortable manner. Well, that is until she becomes fucking Superman. There are other ways to make this look less awkward, guys. Anyways, I'll give The Last Jedi a 7 out of 10. This is certainly the longest Star Wars film, and at points, it definitely overstays its welcome. Although, I think if Rian Johnson got the chance to make a Star Wars movie that was completely disconnected from the main series, he could do some incredible work. And he's even expressed interest in doing so. This might be a hot take, but I think this is a better film than Rogue One. Does it still have its issues? Absolutely. But overall, I find this one more entertaining. Shortly before George Lucas sold Lucasfilm in 2012, he had story ideas for a Han Solo origin film. He wound up commissioning Lawrence Kasdan to write the screenplay for the film. However, Lawrence was brought in to help with the script on The Force Awakens, so his son Jonathan Kasdan was brought in to finish the script. Shortly after, Phil Lord and Christopher Miller were set to direct the film. If you don't know who they are, there's a good chance you know what they worked on. They wrote and directed Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs and the Lego Movie. They also directed both 21 Jump Street films. Phil Lord co-wrote Into the Spider-Verse, both of them wrote Across the Spider-Verse, and my favorite, they produced Cocaine Bear. Now, if you've seen those movies, and this one, you may be asking, what happened? This is a very different film than their usual style. And you'd be right. That's precisely why they were fired about halfway through production due to creative differences. The story seems to be that Phil Lord and Chris Miller were trying to make the film a comedy, which makes sense given their background. However, apparently both Kasdan and Kathleen Kennedy were unhappy with their work, so in June of 2017, they were fired. A few directors were thrown around to see who could finish the production, including Joe Johnston and Kasdan himself. It was later announced that Ron Howard would be the one to direct throughout the rest of the production, which included reshooting about 70% of the film. Jesus fucking Christ. Ron Howard is actually not a bad choice. He's already friends with George Lucas, and he already worked with Lucas in American Graffiti where he plays Steve. He also directed Willow, which was a Lucasfilm production and an idea by George Lucas himself. Now, I can't say that I've seen many of Ron Howard's directed films. The only other one I've seen is Willow. But I think what he does here is super interesting, or at least what I think he did. Okay, I need to make it clear that this film definitely has issues, and I think you can tell just by watching it. I'll probably go for the biggest one, and I mean that literally, the pacing. This film has some weirdly terrible pacing. The first 45 minutes or so feel like they drag, and the rest of the film feels like it just speeds by. I have no idea if this is just a me thing, or if it's something truly wrong with the script and or editing. Another big criticism that I know I'm definitely not alone on is this film's really dark. I don't mean that in a, oh, it's super fucked up way. I mean it in a turn on a fucking light way. It's like the lighting from Fant 4-Stick. It's so goddamn dark for literally no reason. Either the gaffers and or key grips weren't doing their jobs, or the color grading was truly bad. I'm willing to believe it's the second because most of this film feels like it was digitally darkened for no reason. The biggest problem of the film for me is, funnily enough, something that doesn't even last very long. It's the Darth Maul bullshit at the end. Now here's the thing. I actually get why he shows up. He's the actual leader of Crimson Dawn, and it's known that Crimson Dawn helped in the Siege of Mandalore shown in the Clone Wars show. But the reason why I hate it so much is, 1, it kind of just feels like fan service. 2, it doesn't really relate to the rest of the story. And 3, it never built up to anything. 7 years later, we still never got a follow-up on what happened. At least not in a show or movie form. It probably happened in a novel or something. I feel like a strength of this film is that it felt like you didn't really need to watch any other Star Wars movie or show to fully understand or enjoy it. This could have been your first Star Wars experience and you would have been fine. Until this bullshit. The point of a standalone story is for it to be exactly that. Standalone. The idea that you don't need anything else to enjoy it, just enjoy it for what it is. But by awkwardly putting this scene in the film itself, you ruin that idea of the film being standalone. If it was something like a post-credits scene, I may have been a little bit more okay with it, but because you dropped this at the end of the film, now you're going to confuse the audience that doesn't really follow that closely to Star Wars, so they might not know how Maul is still alive, or worst case scenario, they don't know who he is at all. Why is Darth Maul showing up in a film about Han Solo anyway? I just can't get over how stupid that is. Although he was played by Ray Park again, and this time voiced by Sam Witwer, but otherwise, I just can't get over how stupid this was. Although here's where I give my compliments, starting with Alden Ehrenreich. Now I should state, he doesn't really look like Harrison Ford. That's not a criticism, just an observation. However, he fucking nailed the character. Literally from Han's first line in this film, I was like, yep, that's just a young Han Solo. Another great performance is Donald Glover as Lando Calrissian. I also don't really think he looks much like Billy D. Williams, but again, he has the character down perfectly. Even the way he says Han just oozes of Billy D. Williams' original performance. I think the rest of the cast, though, is fine. Emilia Clarke, Woody Harrelson, Paul Bettany, and Phoebe Waller-Bridge are passable. I wouldn't be able to immediately pinpoint a good scene with any of them or memorable moments involving them. I'd also like to point out the writing. I honestly think it's weirdly good at establishing certain things in later films, barring how Han Solo got his name. Seriously, what was that? Like, for example, a reason why Lando calls him Han instead of Han. Did they need to explain that? No, it was just a quirk of Lando. But I think it's interesting that they did. Another thing is how they set up something that was only implied in one line of dialogue from the original trilogy. The idea that L3, in a way, is part of the Millennium Falcon because she had a good navigation system. In Empire Strikes Back, C-3PO only makes a single remark about how strange the Falcon's navigation system is. My favorite, though, is the Kessel Run. Now, if you asked me before this film came out if I wanted to see the Kessel Run, my answer probably would have been no. But it was probably one of the best parts of the film. For years, it was always thought that using parsecs was a mistake, as that's a measurement of distance and not time, and the implication is time. But they actually found a way to make the Kessel Run work. I'm impressed. Something I'm not too sure of, though, is the idea of Lando having feelings for L3. Like, that was a conscious decision. To make Lando a robot fucker. I think the thing that makes it worse is L3 apparently entertains the idea but also doesn't elaborate how that would work. Why do I feel like that was a Lord and Miller scene that they just didn't bother to cut out? One final thing that I love about this film is we finally see Chewie rip someone's arms off. That was always something that we'd heard Wookiees can do, but we never really saw it, so I'm glad it was shown here, even if it was only for the sake of a joke. This film's music is done by John Powell, who you might know for his contributions to a bunch of DreamWorks films, mainly the How to Train Your Dragon series. Although personally, I always think of his work from X-Men The Last Stand. Now here's the thing about this film's score. It's only okay. Now I should mention, I know John Powell can do some truly amazing work. Again, How to Train Your Dragon exists. However, I didn't find much memorable from this film's soundtrack. The only one I did find even slightly memorable wasn't even by him. It was by John Williams. I found a lot of this soundtrack to be derivative. Like, there were certain times I got it, but others, why? Like, here's an example. Why is the track that played during the Death Star trench run played during the Kessel Run in this film? Is it because they both involve a run? My actual guess, it's the same reason why it was also played in The Last Jedi when they were on Crate. Thematic appropriation. I'm not sure if this is an actual term, I just know the YouTuber Sideways brought it up in a video of his, and anytime I tried to look it up, it kept trying to show me results that literally weren't related in the slightest. They use a track you're already familiar with, and hope you get that same rush you did back when you saw the original Star Wars. Even if you may not be able to immediately pinpoint it, your brain recognizes it and gives the correct response. I find this film does that a lot. Like, for example, they use the main Star Wars theme to represent the Millennium Falcon for some reason. The only one of these that actually makes even a lick of sense is Duel of the Fates when Darth Maul shows up. And we already know how I feel about that. The main thing worth mentioning here is L337, who's played by Phoebe Waller-Bridge. The thing I didn't know until learning about it for this video is a very large chunk of her was practical. For things like the wiring and exposed joints and stuff, that was just Phoebe in a green suit, but the rest was actually there on set. When K2SO was entirely CGI, L337 was only partially CGI and the rest practical. I just thought it was really cool. The people at Skywalker Sound actually recorded more sounds of bears for Chewie in this film because they felt limited with the amount of original recordings they had for Chewie. The first thing that Alden Ehrenreich did after he found out he got the part was ride a roller coaster. George Lucas actually arrived on set one day, which also happened to be the same day Ron Howard took over production. I think it's sad that this film underperformed at the box office, mainly because it made it so we didn't get any more standalone Star Wars films for 8 years, but also because I think this is a fun movie. Yeah, it's got its problems, but I've seen far, far worse, even from this franchise. I'll give Solo a 7 out of 10. I've only hinted at what I think about the fandom, but this is probably the one time that I 100% agree with them. This one film is everything wrong with the sequel trilogy. If Force Awakens was in creative debt, this is the film that went creatively bankrupt. Not my best analogy, but you know what I mean. In August of 2015, it was announced Colin Trevorrow would direct this film, and would co-write the script with frequent collaborator Derek Connolly. The script they wrote is very different from this finished film, but I'm going to hold off on that for now and continue with the timeline of events. In August of 2017, it was announced Jack Thorne would rewrite the script. However, producers were unhappy with the original script and even the rewrites done by Jack Thorne. Colin Trevorrow left the project due to creative differences with the producers. Rian Johnson was considered at one point, but he turned it down to work on other things when he was done with The Last Jedi, mainly his next film, Knives Out, which actually came out the same year as this film. Another director that was approached was David Fincher. They really wanted him to make a Star Wars movie, didn't they? Makes sense, as he worked at ILM for a little bit and even worked on Return of the Jedi. He ultimately turned it down, however, as he didn't want to deal with the stress of a production like this. Although I'd kill to see him make a Star Wars project at some point. The director who actually got the job, though, was J.J. Abrams. He'd been working somewhat closely with Kathleen Kennedy after The Force Awakens, so naturally he was approached. He was hesitant at first, but it was encouragement from his wife that led him to take the job. He would also write the film with co-writer Chris Terrio, that still had certain elements from the original Colin Trevorrow script. Principal photography started on August 1st, 2018, and wrapped on February 15th, 2019. There are so many problems here. To say this film is a mess is an understatement. The reason I say that is because this film just completely disregards everything The Last Jedi tried to do. Something that I never even thought about was the timeline of events. Last Jedi didn't come out until December of 2017, but J.J. Abrams was announced as director in September of the same year. Now, rewrites definitely happened after the release of The Last Jedi, but with the extent of stuff that feels like it just ignores The Last Jedi, it makes me think a lot of these decisions were made even before or during Last Jedi's release. So even from the beginning, they were just like, fuck it. The alternative is that they were under pressure by Disney due to the reception of The Last Jedi, and I honestly can't tell which one is worse. Either the creatives saw Last Jedi and ignored huge parts of it for no reason, or they caved because of the fan base and took story ideas from fucking Reddit. The best way to describe this film is as fan fiction. But like, the really, really bad kind. What do you mean Rey is just capable of Force lightning now? What do you mean Kylo Ren just turned to the light side almost for no reason? What do you mean Finn has literally nothing to do in this film? Honestly, it feels like fanfiction from someone who was salty about The Last Jedi. I feel like whether or not you liked The Last Jedi, it at least felt like a movie. It felt like a real production that was filmed. It honestly baffles me how any of this was approved by anyone. Let's start with the overwhelming pace of this film. Pacing is probably one of the most important aspects of any story. You don't want your audience to get bored, but you also don't want them to feel like everything's moving too fast. You have to find that balance and figure out when and how to allocate the time you need. This film throws that out the fucking window. This film moves at the most breakneck pace, like it never tries to calm down for even a second. The worst thing you can do with your film is make it hard to follow because it feels like there's just way too much going on, especially if you're trying to focus on multiple perspectives. Another problem with said breakneck pace is it feels like there are some massive plot holes. Like, I'm usually not one to comment on how lucky characters are in fiction. I think that's usually just a non-criticism that doesn't really work for stories, especially ones like this. But I'm going to use the Pasana scenes as an example. So you're telling me that not only did Lando Calrissian just happen to be on this planet, but trying to find the very same Jedi Hunter, for God knows how long might I add, then, later on, the gang just happened to sink into where he died? It wasn't intentional either. They just crashed, fell into sinking sands, then found his body in the caves below. That one sequence just makes no sense. Forget the whole,
Oh, they fly now!
They fly now?
bullshit. That's the least of this segment's worries. Another major problem I have with the film is Kylo Ren. His redemption feels unearned. Like, it feels like it's just a switch that randomly goes off in his head before he ditches Kylo Ren. At least with Darth Vader, it was properly set up over the course of Return of the Jedi, and he really had to think about his next decision when it came to killing Palpatine. I think the reason it feels so much like a switch-up is because of what The Last Jedi was trying to do. His final moments in that film was him becoming Supreme Leader and having the entire First Order in his grip. In this film, he's just a whiny emo kid like in The Force Awakens again. General Hux also being the Resistance spy is so fucking stupid. I get the whole he hates Kylo Ren thing, but my mind was always that he just hated Kylo Ren because of how he led the First Order and thought he would do a better job. Basically Megatron and Starscream's dynamic in Transformers, but this is not the route I would have taken with that. This film also has a major fake death problem, the first one being Chewie, which I thought was bullshit so fucking quickly because the film would have actually had to be brain dead to try to pull that shit. And it's not even 3 minutes later when he's revealed to be alive. The second is C-3PO. Even though it's not an actual death, it's still treated as such. Yet he gets his memory restored by R2 anyway. The third is Rey herself. We already knew she wasn't gonna die. They would actually have to be the stupidest motherfuckers on the planet to try and pull that shit. Okay, I've beaten around the bush long enough. I'm gonna talk about my personal main 3 problems with this film. Why? Just why? Look, I, to a degree, understand why you'd want to do this. You want this to feel like the end of a 9-movie saga, so bring in the villain from the first 6 films. But not once did they consider just how it should be done. Palpatine fucking blew up, and Luke even said in The Last Jedi that there was balance in the Force for years. If Palpatine is still alive in some way, that balance wouldn't have existed. I also can't believe I'm going to say this, but I'm going to defend the most memed line in this movie. Let me finish. Only to a degree. Because from the Resistance's perspective, they really wouldn't know how he returned. But do you want to know why it's such a bad line? It's because that's really the only explanation you hear. There's no mention of how he actually returned. That's all you get. It's not bad because it only has the word somehow in it. It's bad because it's basically the writers looking you dead in the eye and saying, yeah, this isn't important actually. Do I expect the Resistance to know exactly how? No, especially not this early in the film. But I do feel like I need an explanation because of his fate in Return of the Jedi, and also the fact that he hasn't bothered to show up until now. Let's also not forget that the opening crawl mentions a message from Palpatine, that's also important to the story, that we never actually hear. At least not in the film itself. It could only be heard in a fucking limited Fortnite event. This film was doomed from the beginning. According to JJ, the idea of Palpatine being in this film was in his head for basically 30 seconds before he realized, that's what we have to do. I'm starting to see why I don't like many of his films now. And don't even get me started on how he handled Cloverfield and its sequels. The very fact they decide to make Rey a Palpatine in this film completely destroys what The Last Jedi was going for, and I will argue that until the day that I die. Am I biased because I actually liked how Rey's parents were nobodies? Yes. But even if I didn't like that decision, it's so cowardly, and awkward might I add, that suddenly she's a Palpatine. This one decision almost completely undoes her character arc in The Last Jedi. Seriously, she goes through the entire film wondering who her parents were, even trying to find some sort of parental figure in at first Han and then later Luke, so when Rey learns that her parents were nobodies, it almost breaks her. But ultimately, she finds strength in that revelation. Or you could go the route of she then decide to save the family that she has now, that being her friends and the Resistance as a whole. But I think the most heinous part about her entire arc here is not just that she's a Palpatine, but it's...
Rise Skywalker.
Jesus Christ! No. Please. Please don't say that.
No. No. No.
No!
No, 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 no!
No, this isn't happening!
No! God! No! God, please, no! 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 No!
No! No! No! No! No!
This one line completely destroys Rey's character and what The Last Jedi was trying to set up. Not only did it do that, but also made her already weird kiss with Ben Solo even worse. First of all, I already hate that kiss between them. Second, the fact that immediately afterwards she takes the Skywalker name? Are you fucking kidding me? I know earlier in the film they tried setting up this interaction when another character asks for her name, but the thing is, her answer there should have been here. That initial interaction should have been, I'm Rey. Who are your people? I'm not sure. Then the ending could be, I'm Rey. Rey who? Just Rey. Or something like that. I also know there's people who want her to embrace the Palpatine name, but I think that's also completely wrong, just in the opposite direction of Rey Skywalker. You can give all the excuses you want for her being a Palpatine. The only one I'll even slightly hear you out on is it's a way to explain why she was able to do what she did in prior films with little to no training. But even then, that's not how the Force works. It's one thing to just randomly bring back the big bad of the last two trilogies. It's another thing entirely to awkwardly try to tie him in with the main character just because people didn't like how the last film handled that. Let's also not forget that she shouldn't even be able to force heal, especially with no training. No one should be able to do it. Isn't that literally the way Palpatine manipulates Anakin in Revenge of the Sith, to make him believe he can save Padme with the teachings of Darth Plagueis? This movie just can't do anything right. Also, a slight nitpick that I don't know where else to put, but how was Rey able to make her lightsaber? Look, I also don't like the idea that she just uses Anakin's lightsaber, especially after it was just randomly repaired in between The Last Jedi and this film. But the thing is, how could she have made it? For context, in case you aren't super familiar with the lore, Jedi would craft their own lightsabers after finding a kyber crystal on the planet Ilum that would speak out to them. However, we know due to Rogue One that kyber crystals were very important to powering the Death Star, and in Episode 7, Starkiller Base, clearly based on the Death Star, is literally made from Ilum. Remember, they also blew up Starkiller Base. So how the hell was Rey able to make a lightsaber? She couldn't have used a kyber crystal from one of the other sabers, as hers is yellow, and every other one we've seen is either blue or green. The planet the kyber crystals came from no longer exists, so where did this crystal come from? Also, it should have been double-sided like Maul's was, but that's a different subject. You can just tell this was due to the fan backlash. Rose was probably the most hated character from The Last Jedi, but this is seriously just shitty. The fact that they felt the need to cut her role down so significantly just sucks. Fucking Mary has more lines than her. I'm serious. This also extends to a lot of the other characters. Why the hell do Poe and Finn have almost nothing to do in this film? We finally have a film where they're together for a majority of the runtime, and they do nothing with them. Again, it feels like them being purposely sidelined because of how they were handled in The Last Jedi. Hell, even fucking Lando has basically nothing to do in this film. Why does he not have a scene where he reacts to Han and or Luke's deaths? I feel like that should be a big thing with him, especially since apparently Lando and Luke had a closer connection than we thought according to this film. They literally just brought him back for nostalgia bait. Oh god, where do I begin? Well, first, think about it from a story perspective. What does she really have to do in this film before she dies to help Ben? She was important for Rey's training. Rey literally didn't do jack shit before she went to Pisana with the gang. She was trying to commune with the other Jedi, and that didn't go anywhere until the end of the movie. She trained Rey because she knew that Rey was a Palpatine and wanted to guide her to the light. Rey really only started struggling with the dark side in the last film, and it didn't even really go anywhere here. Let's also not forget, how the fuck did she know Rey was a Palpatine? No, seriously, out of all the shit this film gets, how has basically no one mentioned this? Like, okay, I'll give them that Luke didn't realize because he cut himself off from the Force after his, let's just say, misunderstanding with Ben Solo. But it's literally confirmed in the movie that Leia's training was cut short due to her not wanting Ben to go evil. Did a real bang-up job there, by the way. Like, I assumed her floating back to the ship in The Last Jedi was the most powerful with the Force she'd ever been, especially as Rian Johnson literally explained in the commentary for The Last Jedi that was basically Leia's version of an adrenaline rush. Even fucking Vader wasn't able to sense that Luke was his son, even though Luke did have a darker side to him, even in The Empire Strikes Back. So this makes no sense. Now, maybe I'm misinterpreting it. I'll give you that. But if I am, it's written extremely poorly to what its actual meaning is. I'm assuming just something under the lines of, she sensed the dark side in Rey. But the phrasing to make it sound like she knew it was Palpatine specifically? But I've yapped about that enough. I mentioned during The Last Jedi that Leia's actress, Carrie Fisher, sadly passed away shortly after filming for The Last Jedi had wrapped. It was December of 2016. They had 3 years between that and this film releasing, and not once did they think about a way to possibly write her out of the story if they needed to. In fact, they intentionally wrote extra scenes just to use footage shot for The Force Awakens that was never used. They went out of their way to analyze those unused shots to write scenes around them. It makes it sound like the original idea didn't even have her there. It feels just incredibly disrespectful. The worst part on top of all of this is why they did it. Their reasoning was she was important to the story, to which I say, no, she wasn't. She's literally only important for Kylo Ren's redemption, and even then, that was more ghost Han or whatever the fuck happened there. I'm going to use another example of an actor's likeness used in a similar way from this series. In Rogue One, I mentioned CGI Tarkin. I still don't like it, I made that very clear, but I understand why he was there. Granted, he also didn't add much to the story, but it makes sense for continuity reasons as Rogue One takes place literally right before Episode 4. The reason why it doesn't work for Leia, however, is this story doesn't have anything it has to lead to. Rogue One leads directly into Episode 4. It makes sense to have Tarkin for continuity reasons, but there's nowhere that this film has to lead into. There should be no problem having to work around Carrie Fisher's death in order for your story to work, especially since she doesn't have much to do here anyway. On top of all of this, Leia's scenes are just super clunky, as you can tell they're not interacting with each other. It's that same disconnect you had from whenever people talked to Yoda in the prequels. They had basically nothing to go off of for their performances. It's the same here. Just the way Leia talks isn't the right tone for any given scene. Because it wasn't. It was from a completely different situation. I just can't get over this fucking decision. It's always one of the first things I point to as to why this film is just shit. It felt like it completely disregarded Carrie Fisher's death, and they awkwardly brought her back from the dead just so she would become important for like 2 minutes. This is the worst Star Wars soundtrack that was done by John Williams. Period. Like, every time I think about it, I just get extremely upset. The worst part? I don't even think most of it is his fault. He was trapped in the hellhole that was this movie's story, and just kind of did the best he could. I should also mention, most of these talking points are from a video Sideways did about this film. Please go watch it as he explains it in much better detail than I ever could. It's actually mentioned in one of the featurettes, that being the Maestro's finale, that a specific scene was the fault of the music editor and not Williams. That scene is when Ghost Luke lifts his X-Wing out of the water and it plays Yoda's theme. The worst part? The music editor's reasoning for this was basically that it would be for nostalgia purposes. JJ even questioned it, but for some reason went along with it. That one part of the featurette puts a lot of things into perspective when it comes to this soundtrack, because that's a major problem throughout the entire thing. Remember how for Solo I mentioned them using a lot of the older tracks was thematic appropriation? Well, with that, you also run the risk of accidentally recontextualizing what certain tracks are supposed to mean. Now, thematic recontextualization is nothing new to Star Wars. I went on many tangents about how certain themes were used and what they represent. But at least what they started to represent made sense. It made sense for Binary Sunset to be used as the Force theme. It made sense that Imperial March would specifically be about Vader, especially with Phantom Menace making that clear. But here, it's not that at all. I briefly mentioned it in the last film, but it's at its worst here. The original theme no longer represents Luke Skywalker. In this film, it represents really anything from the original trilogy. That is such an awkward thing, especially since every movie, including the prequels, plays it at the beginning. That's another problem with this soundtrack, and the sequel trilogy as a whole. There is not a single time when a track from the prequels is played. The moment this was pointed out to me, I can never unhear it. There's only 2 instances in the entire trilogy I can think of. One in The Last Jedi where Finn's about to sacrifice himself, and it sounds like a track from the prequels. I'm not sure if it actually was one. It sure as hell sounded like one though. If it is a real prequel track, please tell me which one because I couldn't figure it out. The second is from this movie during Rey's training. For a brief moment, it sounded like it played Battle of the Heroes. But that's it. Other than that, nothing. The music feels like it's trying to be nostalgic, but there's not a single thing from the prequels. It's all the original trilogy. If you're trying to have the finale to a 9-movie saga, wouldn't you want to have some of those elements from the prequels? Just one? This film also just has a major issue overplaying themes. The Emperor's theme is almost always blaring, and it's like, oh my god, we get it. I'm going to use the Phantom Menace as an example of how it should have been done. The ending of Phantom Menace has this celebration scene. If you slow down the song that plays during it, you can actually hear Palpatine's theme. It's a subtle way of communicating that the only person that will benefit from this in the long run is Palpatine. Here, you know exactly what's going on. There's even instances where Palpatine's theme is playing when it really shouldn't be because the First Order shouldn't know about him yet. It genuinely makes me so mad that this foreboding theme just randomly became the theme for anything even slightly sinister in this film. I'll also mention the obvious example of how at the end they use Rey's theme when they should have used Binary Sunset, and they used Binary Sunset when they should have used Rey's theme. This has been talked about to death, but why is it when she's communicating with the Force, that's when it doesn't play? But it doesn't play her theme when she's killing Palpatine? Isn't the whole point that she's all the Jedi? Why not represent that with her theme? This soundtrack actively mocks you for paying attention. The worst part? I don't even think all of it was intentional. Like, how did Rose's theme not get played once? Not even a little brief play for like the 2 scenes she's in? This is one of the few Star Wars soundtracks I actively do not like. How the hell was this nominated for Best Score and Endgame wasn't? This is also related to the music, but it needs to be stated. So shortly after the film came out, we found out through John Williams' brother, Don Williams, that John had penned about 3 hours of music for this film. 3 hours! It was never recorded, or at least not all of it, but that is insane to me. I think John Williams was trying absolutely everything in his power to save this film musically, and someone, or multiple people, were actively holding him back. I don't know if Disney even has access to this, as it was only written, and I'm not sure if they'd even want to pay an orchestra to have it recorded, but the fact that they haven't made any effort to release it in some way is just sad to me. Like, do you hate money? Actually, don't answer that. Now, would said 3 hours have saved the film? Probably not. Especially since if it's exactly 180 minutes of music, 38 minutes of it would go completely unused unless they released a longer cut of the film. Every time I think of what the score could have been, it makes me so angry that this is what we got. Also, there was apparently going to be a new version of Duel of the Fates that was used only in marketing, so Thanks for that, Abrams. Or Disney. I don't know who exactly is responsible. Just let me be mad, okay? Like The Last Jedi, there are surprisingly a lot more practical effects than you'd expect. A weird one that I thought of was Maz Kanata. Apparently she was only an animatronic in this film, except for CG touch-ups, which is quite normal. I just think it's strange, as Maz was entirely CGI in the last two films. There was also the giant snake in the sand caves or whatever on Pasana. It was a giant puppet that was operated by several people, although it was apparently replaced with CGI in most shots. The only noteworthy thing I got from the behind-the-scenes stuff involving CGI is apparently they used green screen during the Pasana chase, even though they were on location in Jordan. The reason it's easier to figure out lighting, as most of the lighting would be natural. That's it. That's all I got. In January of 2020, only a month after this film's release, there was a leaked script called Star Wars Episode 9: Duel of the Fates. This was the original script that Colin Trevorrow and Derek Connolly wrote before being replaced by Chris Terrio and J.J. Abrams. While there were specific elements in this script reused in this film, it's almost entirely different. The worst part, it's so much better. There wasn't any awkward retcons, Finn and Poe actually have something to do, also including Rose, and it actually ties in better with the other films, more specifically, the prequels. Obviously, there's still some rough spots, and things that might not make sense from a lore perspective, but it feels like a much more natural continuation of Last Jedi than whatever the fuck this film was. Not to mention, the name of this script is named after one of the music tracks from the prequels. This one name alone already tells you it's trying to be the finale to this 42-year saga. Kylo Ren's repaired helmet is based on kintsugi. I hope I said that correctly. I'm so sorry if I didn't. Which is a method of repairing broken objects with gold that originated in Japan. The planet Kijimi is inspired by Hidden Fortress, which was a major inspiration for Episode 4. There's a cameo by John Williams on Kijimi, and every single item that he's surrounded by is based on every film he was nominated for Best Score. Here's the list of all of them. I'm not reading all that. The Ewoks you see at the end of the film are supposed to be Wicket and his son, or at least that's how Warwick Davis describes it in the featurette Warwick and Son. And Dio was voiced by JJ himself. When I first saw this film, I was more perplexed than anything. I saw this film with my dad on opening day, and the moment the credits started rolling, I think I just went numb. The first words to leave my mouth were just, I have no idea how I feel about that, which is probably the worst thing you could ever hear me say about a film. Period. I was honestly just confused. It wasn't until around 5 months later when it was added onto Disney Plus when I finally realized, I hate this film. I hate what this film did. I hate what it meant for the rest of the series. I hate this film! There is nothing about this film that tells me that it's supposed to be a big finale. What makes it even worse is it came out the same year as Avengers Endgame. That was only after 11 years of build-up, and most people will tell you it was worth it. That is a great finale, even if the film itself is only okay, but that's for a different time. This was not that. It decided to say nothing new, it completely undid The Last Jedi, and on top of that, it's just a bad movie. I don't just mean in terms of Star Wars, I mean in general. I'll give The Rise of Skywalker a 3 out of 10. The fact that most of my notes from this film are variations of the phrase, fuck this movie, that's not a good sign. Literally the only positive I'll give it is, it looks nice, I guess. Sure, let's go with that. I think it's very clear that this trilogy wasn't really planned out, especially with how reactionary Rise of Skywalker was. This isn't going to be a one-to-one comparison, for what I hope will be obvious reasons, but it's something I noticed while watching this trilogy for the making of this video. You know how the Dark Knight trilogy starts off with the League of Shadows and that whole thing, only for the Dark Knight to basically ignore it in place of the Joker, and then for the Dark Knight Rises to randomly make the League of Shadows stuff important again? That's how this trilogy feels. Again, not quality-wise, but just in terms of how they handle the overarching story. You can tell a lot of what Rise of Skywalker is trying to do not only feels like it's going against The Last Jedi, but also actively tries to bring back stuff from The Force Awakens that Rian Johnson elected to ignore. My main examples being the Knights of Ren and Finn's foreshadowing of being Force-sensitive in some way. It feels like JJ is trying to rush those storylines because they weren't given the 2 movies they needed to develop. Another big thing that I really only touched upon while talking about the music in The Rise of Skywalker is how this trilogy basically ignores everything from the prequel trilogy. There are literally only 2 locations from the prequels specifically that are shown in this trilogy. And both of them are in Rise of Skywalker. The first one is Mustafar in the opening scene, which even then, it's on a completely different part of the planet, so you might not even realize that it is Mustafar. And when Poe starts light speed skipping and we're in Coruscant for like 5 seconds. Or maybe it's Bespin, which, if that's the case, that makes it even worse. Okay, I get why you wouldn't want to acknowledge them much in The Force Awakens purely because of the still rampant hatred for the prequels back around that time. But the fact that almost nothing from them were acknowledged in episodes 8 and 9 is suspicious as hell, especially when there's no music played from the prequels either. Hell, they're referenced more in Rogue One and Solo, for Christ's sake. Like, if you're going to call this trilogy episodes 7 through 9, you need to acknowledge what came before. The only other thing I can think of is Palpatine repeating the line,
"The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural,"
in Rise of Skywalker, which could have worked if it wasn't a line that was already memed to death beforehand. I think the worst part is, it's easy to just say, oh well, they should have just planned it out and it would have worked better. Well, yes, that could have been true. I think there's another thing people just aren't seeing. If they had to kind of just go along movie by movie, why not release them 3 years apart instead of 2? I'm being serious, the 2-year gaps between films is literally the reason Rise of Skywalker is the way it is. If it had 3-year gaps between films, not only would it be more consistent with the other trilogies, but it also gives more time for the creatives involved to figure out the best way to continue the story, instead of having to rush a film just because you apparently didn't like the original script and you have a deadline to meet. This trilogy is just plagued with wasted opportunity and knee-jerk reactions. Oh, people thought Force Awakens was too formulaic and just a repeat of A New Hope? Okay, then the next movie is the vision of just one filmmaker. Oh, people didn't like what he did with some characters and plot lines? Okay, then try to make the next film please the people who didn't like the last one without even thinking about the people who actually did like the last one. I get wanting to change direction if you're worried that your audience won't show up for the next installment. But this is the most extreme way to do it. Did you really need to sideline a character all because some fans were despicable human beings to the actress? Even Jar Jar was still somewhat important in later films after Phantom Menace. This trilogy is just so baffling that it needs to be studied. I think the thing about all of this that pisses me off the most is the fact that Rise of Skywalker, at least to a degree, is the way that it is because of people complaining about The Last Jedi. Now I should clarify, I don't mean the people who had genuine problems with the film regarding the filmmaking, especially as even I had problems with it. I mean the people that for basically 2 years straight only badmouthed it and didn't even try actually engaging with the film, and I'd argue still don't. I normally don't like blaming fandoms for stupid decisions like this, but it certainly doesn't help just how drastic the change between Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker was. You can also tell most of the stuff that was almost completely ignored is stuff people complained about in The Last Jedi. Overall, the main thing about this trilogy is just how disconnected it feels from not only itself, but the other trilogies. The goal of George Lucas was that if you watched The Phantom Menace all the way to Return of the Jedi, it would feel like one big movie and not 6 separate movies. Now, do I think he succeeded? No. Not even in the slightest. But I can, to a degree, see what he was trying to go for. I can't say the same for this trilogy. You can see the shifts between this trilogy alone, and when you add it to the rest of the saga, it makes it even more obvious just how different it is. There's so many aspects of this trilogy that feels like it was doomed from the beginning, and it breaks my heart that when I hear about original ideas for this trilogy, it just reminds me of what we were actually left with. But maybe I might be wrong in all this. Maybe there will be some sort of reevaluation when the kids who grew up with these movies start having voices on the internet. Hell, I'd argue it's already started. In between the making of the last episode and this one, I encountered a subreddit dedicated to fans of the sequel trilogy where they discuss their love for it. While I personally don't agree with a lot of it, it's good to know people still have no problems talking about these in a positive light. It may only be 6.1 thousand members at the time of writing this, but at least it's something. I just think it sucks that I do genuinely like Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. It's just Rise of Skywalker that's the sour note. In fact, I feel like if the original Duel of the Fates was made instead, I feel like reception would have just been instead of the worst thing to ever happen in the history of ever. At least that's what some people make it sound like. And with that concludes episode 3 of this 4-episode series on why I dislike being a Star Wars fan. I know I took a little bit of a hiatus from this series so I could work on my DCEU series, or at least the first 2 parts, because at that point, the new Superman was coming out, and I was pretty excited about that, and I wanted to work on a video while the topic of all of that stuff was still at its height. So, yeah. As for when the next episode of this series is going to come out, I don't know. Because as I'm recording this, I'm not done writing the script. Yeah. And I know that's probably going to be one of my probably the most important episode, purely because not only of just the amount of content that I have to talk about, but also just a lot of the other stuff that I need to cover, and also why I need to justify what I called this series what I did. Yeah, I want to say I'm about halfway through. But yeah, I hope you guys can be just a little bit patient waiting for it. 'Cause yeah, I want the script to be as good as possible, and I really need to justify some of the stuff that I've brought forth in this series. So yeah, I thank you for listening to all of my yapping, and yeah, I'll see you next time. This is also related to the music, but it needs to be stated. So shortly after the film came out, we found out through John Williams' brother, Don Williams, that Jod, fucking Jod.
It's pronounced Jod, by the way.
God damn it.